London, Ulysses, back again with another video. So last time I read some pages from the Lestrygonians episode out of this edition, The Penguin, James Joyce. And I'd like to comment this time on the first half of the chapter. That's quite a number of pages. We read in the pub this week about 23 pages from 190 to halfway down 213. It's going to take me a fair bit of unpacking to go through all of that. I thought I'm sort of going to do it, but I thought I would try and get some sort of angle on it. I'm not going to deal with the Homeric parallel. I did that last time in the video in which I read the selection of these pages, so go back and check that out. That will be Lestrygonians 1.1. This is Lestrygonians 1.2. So revert to that if you want the Homeric parallel. I may have talked in that a little bit about peristalsis, which is one of the techniques of the chapter Joyce tells us in his schemata. Peristalsis is the process by which the body digests food. We inject it into our mouths. It is then, perhaps by gravity, taken down into the esophagus. But from there on in, it needs to be pushed around. The body needs to push it through from the esophagus. I'm no medical, but just generally speaking, into the stomach. From there into the large intestine, or one of the intestines anyway. Eventually, waste material will be removed, or the goodness will be extracted, leaving the waste material, which ends up in the rectum, and before being disposed of when we go to the toilet. So, and it is pushed around, moved through the system by this process called peristalsis, which is a stop-start, a squeezing of muscles, pushing it down, and then pausing, and then another push, and that's how food is taken through us. So in the same way, Bloom's movement through the city has been likened in this to a similar process. His thinking, he moves along one thought, then is distracted, moves down another thought, then is reminded of the first thought and comes back to it. This stop-start process. I thought the angle that I'd use would be to take two primary thoughts that he has. Because it's coming up to lunchtime, he's thinking a lot about food. He's increasingly hungry as his blood sugar drops. That hunger imposes on himself more and more and affects his mood. The other aspect that's affecting his mood is sex. Now, we know naughty Mr. Bloom, in any event, thinks quite a lot about sex. Gives him pleasure to think about it, but pretty soon the bloom is off the rose, because when he thinks of sex, he very invariably thinks of Molly. And as soon as he's on to Molly, then he's reminded of what's going to happen, or he suspects will happen later that afternoon. It's now about 1 o'clock. He thinks Blazes Boylan is going to turn up around 4, so the clock is inexorably ticking around to that fateful time. And I thought I'd have a look at how this affects his moods, and he sort of almost pendulum-like. He goes up, and his mood swings up and down, and I'll go through and point out where I think. It's not exactly scientific, but it broadly follows some sort of order in that sense. So starting on Yeah, I'll start on page 190. And fittingly, the chapter opens with Bloom finding himself in a sweet shop in Graham Lemons, and he's observing the sales girl scooping up different sweets: pineapple rock, lemon platt, butterscotch. Um, it's obviously a successful sweet shop that has served sweets to the royal family, because there's a by royal appointment sort of symbol there, which makes him think of His Majesty the King sitting on his throne sucking red jujubes white. Quite an imperial image, that, isn't it? Sucking out the flavour of perhaps subjugated countries such as Ireland. And then he has a leaflet thrust into his hand. He thinks it's about him. Blue? Me? No. It doesn't say bloom, it says blood of the lamb. There we have, there's a sort of peristaltic hint there that blue, then it stops, and then he continues. No, blood of the lamb, and it's an evangelical Christian event being advertised here. We know that Bloom likes an advert, and it's advertising that Elijah is coming. Elijah, one of the great Old Testament prophets, but also very impactful on the New Testament as well, thanks to virtually the last words of the book of Malachi, which we can talk about in due course. But this Elijah is coming is a self-appointed priest, Dr. John Alexander Dowie, and real person. You can look him up. Bloom is immediately cynical, because he thinks that this guy is into polygamy, and he thinks his wife will soon put a stop to that. Right, whereas I'm looking now for my first mood swing. This bit on top of page 191. He sees Daedalus's daughter. Empathetic Bloom makes him a little sad, I would say. He recognizes that she's Simon Daedalus's daughter, knew her at once from her father, lobbing about waiting for him, i.e. Simon Daedalus. It's a shame. Home always breaks up when the mother goes. 15 children, goodness me. The priest, he seems to think that Catholic families have got to have lots of kids, or the priest won't give the woman the confession. His mood deteriorates further, thinking about priests in a sort of simianical way, in that the priests never go hungry. You know, their flock do, but the priests have always got plenty to eat. And further down the page, further empathy. Good Lord, that poor child's dress is in flitters. Underfed she looks too. He continues in fairly sanguine mood with the sighting of the Guinness float. He thinks all the Guinness goes off to England, although it sours on the way over, he's heard. And now he, at the bottom of page 191, looking down, he's at the he's O'Connell Bridge. He's on O'Connell Bridge, looking down at the Liffey, almost tempted to throw himself in. If I threw myself down, he thinks back to Reuben J. Dodd's son, who did, and what the sewage would do to you if you swallowed any of it. He throws down he crumples up the leaflet, throws it down for the gulls, who aren't such damn fools. They think it's food, go down, but recognise that it isn't. But then, continuing with his empathy, he does buy them a couple of apple cakes. We've got some Shakespeare in the middle there, which sort of chimes with Stephen's thought earlier, and throws it. So he does a nice thing because he's empathetic, throws some apple cakes down, but then his cynicism continues. I'm not giving them any more. They didn't even thank me. So still in sort of sanguine mood, I would say. The reference to Kino's 11 shillings trousers, again, he does like an advert. This is simply a board placed on a rowing boat in the middle of the Liffey, which has really impressed him because he thinks they might have got that for free. It's really prime position, right in the middle of the city centre. But no one owns water. I mean, maybe they don't even pay for that. That makes him think of other. Kino's 11 shillings might also have a Kabbalah twist to it, a Jewish mysticism twist. K11, K being the 11th letter of the alphabet, and then 11 shillings. There might be something also linking with the word Kelly. Has anyone here seen Kelly? K-E-L-L-Y, so it's spelt out for us. If we Hebraize that, which Hebrew is an alphabet without vowels, if you take the vowels away from Kelly, you're left with K-L-L or K11. 11, so that's 1111 if K is the 11th letter of the alphabet, 11 being the number of renewal, the number of resurrection. Once you've counted all your fingers and thumbs, you have to start again with the number 11. So very much a number that symbolizes, I don't know enough about Kabbalah, what it means. I can't tell you what it means in Jewish mysticism terms, but in our book, and particularly in Finnegan's Wake, it is associated with renewal, the rise, sort of the opposite of 32, being the fall. So there we are. We have, I think it's too much of a coincidence that it's K11 there. He thinks about further self-advertising, both the dancing instructor who prances around Dublin in very flamboyant clothes and walks very stylishly, and also the doctor that he recalls used to go down into male public urinals and post up adverts about how he could treat sexually transmitted diseases, because where else is he going to advertise, I suppose? And that also seems to impress Bloom. But then, and here we have our first real downer, I would say. He's gone from just empathetic to now his mood swings downwards, because as he thinks of sexually transmitted disease, and as soon as he's on to sex, he thinks of Molly, and that what if Boylan, there we are right at the bottom of 193, if he, no, I don't believe it, he wouldn't surely, no, Boylan, if he had a sexually transmitted disease, surely he wouldn't sleep with Molly that afternoon. So there he's way down. Then we have a reference to the word parallax, very important word in our book. I will simply, and it's sort of simply a way of measuring the distance of one planet from another, and the distance of planets from Earth, and sort of seeing, very much simplified, seeing something from different points of view. And we will, as our book progresses, we will think about that. Now, his mood then improves. Mr. Bloom smiled, thinking of Molly and the way that Molly would, how Molly talks about big words and complicated words like metempsychosis. She said, met him pike hoses. And Bloom fondly thinks of her. He says, "Yes, she's right. It's just about big words, just ways to confuse us, really." Describing actually not terribly difficult things, but in a way that makes it difficult for us to understand. So his mood is now up, and it remains up as he then sees a procession of sandwich men with letters on their hats spelling out the word Healy's. Bloom's ex-employer, Wisdom Healy, had a stationery shop at 5 Dane Street. But then Bloom, his mood drops again slightly when he thinks how little money they have. 3 bob a day walking along the gutters, street after street, just keep skin and bone together. He wonders if they are Boylan's men, Boylan being the sort of thing he would organise. He's into a range of businesses, from putting on concerts to generally sort of marketing and advertising. We'll learn that he's also a boxing promoter, fingers in lots of pies. As it's a form of advertising, he thinks it's not a very good form, typical for Wisdom Healy. When he was there, he would recommend much better forms. He gives an example on the top of page 195, and his mood sort of raises, makes a happier memory, as he thinks when one of his jobs at Wisdom Healy, he had to collect money for the adverts from customers, and sometimes he would have to go out to convents, and he remembers with affection a particular nun, a sister. What does it say? A sister? I'm not sure, but the convent was Our Lady of Mount Carmel. He thinks of her, and I think he thinks a little randomly, actually, that had she married, she probably only became a nun because she didn't get married. Anyway, there was some sort of glint in her eye, I think, there. Unless I'm reading too much into that, his mood is suddenly up. But then on 196, it drops again, because he's working out when he was at Wisdom Healy, and 10 years ago, 94, he died. Is that this Phil Gilligan died, or is he thinking Rudy died in 94? Because I do believe Rudy died in January 1904. So that would bring his mood back down. But in 94, Val Dillon was the Lord Mayor. Reminds him of attending the Glencree dinner with Molly, wearing a dress in which she looked really fabulous. People were looking after her, and that raises his mood again. Middle of 196, happier then. Yeah, and so there we are, a slightly upbeat Bloom on 196. And his mood remains upbeat. Add to the light here. Here we are. His mood remains upbeat through 197. Really, he thinks after a concert, when they got back halfway down there, could see her in the bedroom from the hearth, unclamping the busk of her stays, white. Swish and soft flop her stays made on the bed, always warm from her, always liked to let herself out, sitting there until near 2, taking out her hairpins, Millie tucked up in Beddy House, happy. That was the night, so we don't know what is going to happen that night, because in this stop-start fashion, he is then interrupted. He's interrupted by Mrs. Breen, who sees him on the street, and then we get one of the few bits of dialogue in this episode, mainly where Bloom's interior monologue, but here we have dialogue for the next 2 or 3 pages, and we don't get a lot of mood swing, I don't think, because Bloom is distracted in conversation. He hasn't got so much time for his thoughts, although they do intrude occasionally, generally about food. So we learn about Mrs. Breen, we learn about her husband, Dennis Breen, and how he's been so offended that someone has sent him this postcard that simply says UP :up on it, or at least we think there is a possibility it might just say UP, and people are looking at it and reading UP up. But let's assume, as most commentators do, that it says UP up. What does that mean? We don't know. A lot of conjecture about what it means. It could be Ulster Protestant. It could mean under proof. It could mean that he goes to the toilet upwards, like with some sort of erectile dysfunction or something dysfunctioning. We just don't know. And I'm afraid we don't get the answer in the book unless some bright spark one day will spot it. But anyway, we learn about that, and we also learn as he's speaking to her that he feels, even though they clearly used to be a bit sweet on each other before Molly came on the scene, Josie Breen got edged out once Molly was there, and that Bloom thinks to himself, she hasn't aged as well as Molly. Nothing really compares to Molly. I think you'll find as we go through the book, other women just don't come up to scratch. We also learn about Mina Purefoy, a poor woman who's been in labour for 3 days at the lying-in hospital, as it's called. And Bloom will actually go to that hospital later that evening. We meet a character, Cashel Boyle O'Connor Fitzmaurice Tisdall Farrell, based on a real person from those days in Dublin, known as Endymion. And quite a character. Obviously, it looks like he's a little dotty along with Dennis Breen. So that little distraction takes us through to 202, and Bloom walks on. On 202, his mood, I would say, is slightly up when he thinks about who would write that postcard. He conjectures that it may well be Alf Bergen or Richie Goulding writing for a lark. He goes past the Irish Times. I'm not quite sure what his mood is in here, but he thinks about all the responses he's had to the ad that he placed in there. The ad read, "Wanted, smart lady typist to aid gentleman in literary work." One of those respondents was Lizzie Twigg, and Bloom thinks of the response she actually makes. "My literary efforts have had the good fortune to meet with the approval of the eminent poet A.E., Mr. George Russell." Bloom takes against her for reasons that are not entirely clear, but I think we can probably work out that he didn't want someone genuinely interested in helping a gentleman in literary work. He wants some dirty, perverted correspondence about whacking him on the bottom and saying naughty words to him. So someone that talks about her genuine literary experience, he really isn't very interested in. And he thinks about these literary types, and he imagines the sort of what a woman looks like that helped George Russell, whom we will hear a bit about shortly and meet next chapter. What someone that worked with him is likely to look like. And he imagines she'll be into poetry, she'll be fairly plain and pale and thin, with stockings that don't quite hold up, wrinkled stockings that fall down. And this does absolutely nothing for Leopold Bloom. And his mood raises again on page 203, because he thinks about the sort of woman that does something for him, a more of a manly woman that is quite upper class, tends to be upper class, but strident, probably into country pursuits like horse riding. And when she does join the hunt, then doesn't ride side saddle in a feminine way, but rides in the masculine fashion, and knocks back a brandy or whatever it was, and a bit like the one that he saw this morning when that was about to get up into the cab, or he also thinks of a lady called Mrs. Miriam Dandrake, from whom he purchased some second-hand underwear and various dress garments, which isn't as sordid as it sounds, because he and Molly at one point ran as a sort of sideline a business renting out second-hand evening clothes if someone was performing in a concert or going to a concert and they needed and it was black tie, or as most things were in those days. So, and where would he get these clothes from? He would buy them off people willing to sell to him, and this woman struck him as that sort of person. All this is quite upbeat. Suddenly we're downbeat again as he thinks about Mrs. Purefoy in labour for 3 days, empathetic Bloom. This concerns him. He doesn't have a great impression of her husband, Theodore Purefoy, the Methodist, and not impressed that he's given her a child almost for every year of her marriage, and she's forever either pregnant or breastfeeding, or both at the same time. Selfish those TTs are, those teetotals. Yes, these abstemious Methodists, but not so abstemious when it comes to procreation. Continues, through 204, continuing downbeat, more on Mrs. Purefoy, and he, we get not only town planning Bloom, but a sort of socialist Bloom. First of all, he thinks about, instead of the likes of Dan Dawson making speeches about how wonderful Ireland was in the olden days, wouldn't it be better if we all just faced these problems and built decent maternity hospitals with, well equipped, where women could have a better labour and clean and hygienic births? He goes on to think, and while we're at it, he sort of solves social security, really. He thinks that everyone ought to, every child born ought to have some money put aside for it, given by the state, and then by the time it attains 21 or whatever, it's really going to amount to a tidy sum, and people, that will sort of solve quite a lot of poverty. And that brings his mood up as we get to the bottom of page 204, because funny sight of the two of them together. Bloom remembers Molly pregnant with Millie, I'm assuming, and Mrs. Moisel was pregnant. I think I heard that there was a Mrs. Moisel gave birth to Rebecca around that sort of time. And this makes him think fondly. And then the old midwife, Mrs. Thornton. Surprised though he doesn't think about Rudy, and that brings him down again. Doesn't seem to. By the Irish House of Parliament on 2:05, a flock of pigeons flew. He thinks about conversations they'll be having with each other about emptying their bowels on people below and target practice, and this sort of makes him laugh. He observes uh, some policemen uh, debauched from College Street. So they just had lunch and now they're marching out again while another squad are just coming back in for their lunch. There's Thomas More's statue. It amuses him that he's the statue, seeing as he wrote a poem called The Meeting of the Waters. It's right that his statue should be above where is now a male urinal. I say male urinal, there were no female public toilets. Seeing the police, he thinks about matters police. He thinks about when he got caught up in a demonstration, obviously an anti-British demonstration, and it became pretty pro-Boer, pro sort of Boer War, which is sort of ironic. The Irish at that time, the Irish nationalists, they would support anyone fighting the British, even if they were other imperialists, in this case, Dutch colonialists trying to claim South Africa for themselves. And his mood swings back down again as he thinks that among all those rebellious young men, two reasons: that not only will they all become civil servants and magistrates in 10 years' time or so and just become part of the system, he's talking about medical students, so you'd need to be fairly middle class and probably Protestant in order to do that. But secondly, there would have been many spies among them. He thinks about Corny Kelleher as a touch of Harvey Duff in his eye. He thinks about I think it might have even been the leader of the gang of Invincibles. Was it James Carey or Peter Carey that eventually gave evidence to give them all up in return for an escape to South Africa? But unfortunately, within the nationalist cause in Ireland at the time, there were many, many spies that either for money or because they were plainclothes policemen that just infiltrated and undermined the cause. So potentially this brings Bloom's mood down a little. Whether Bloom is more Parnellian than nationalist, he was still part of the anti-British, we want the Brits out sort of thing. So he thinks about, and even though, and then his mood grows up again, thinking about James Stephen and what a good idea he had. James Stephen was the head centre, the boss of the IRB, and seems to be credited here with the idea of having fairly close-knit cells of 10, so that you could only, if you were going to give anyone up, it would only be your immediate circle. Sinn Féin, either because that was the forerunner of the party, or Sinn Féin meaning we ourselves, we stand for each other. But back out you get the knife. So if they, once you're into one of these cells, you're in it for life. And if ever you want to go straight, as it were, probably the wrong word, but anyway, they'll do you. And if you stay in with them and the British get you, you'll get the firing squad. Thinking of Sinn Féin, he obviously thinks of Arthur Griffith, the founder of Sinn Féin, and how he doesn't really match up to Parnell, and who would? Is this a touch of the sentimentality, looking back on the previous golden era that Joyce thought was so problematic for the Irish at the time. They needed to look forward to find solutions, not backwards. But I think it is probably generally accepted that Parnell was a tall, charismatic, handsome chap. Three characteristics that Griffith, for whatever other worth he had, could not claim. He thinks of the Republicans getting together in the DBC, Dublin Bakery Company, having debates about that republicanism is the best form of government, that the language question should take precedence of the economic question. So that's all 207. And thinking, whether it's home rule or nationalism, full independence. Again, he's thinking about it in do I detect a fairly optimistic way? But then the mood comes down again as a heavy cloud hiding the sun. And then he thinks useless words. And then his mood really takes a downer. And I can't help paralleling this when Bloom was reading the Zionist leaflet earlier in Agendat and the Time in Calypso, and was thinking about it, in pretty optimistic, ebullient sort of terms about enormous melon fields, and the hard-working docker in his dungarees loading up the oranges to send them across the world. Then the sun goes behind the cloud, and then that completely colours his vision of it, of the country, of the enterprise, and as a vision. And maybe the same thing is happening here with another struggle against the British Irish nationalism. So he thinks useless words, things go on the same day after day. We're all just sort of sausage machines with birth and death and fairly painful lives, and what can you do? And even not just people, cities, dead cities, houses come and go, streets come and go. To what purpose? He really is quite in a miserable state here. And I with these dead cities, I've got a book somewhere behind me on the shelf by Jackson Cope called Joyce's Cities, and there's quite a focus in that on dead cities. And this was an era where Troy, the ancient remains of Troy, had been recently discovered. The poet D'Annunzio, an author, the Italian guy, was pretty influential on the young Joyce. Set a play in among the ruins of Troy in this period, and I get this sort of feeling with Joyce talking about these miles of pavements piled up, bricks and stones, and then they go. Although landlords always seem to remain, but cities come and go. No one is anything. At the bottom of page 208, this is the very worst hour of the day. Hate this hour. Feel as if I've been eaten and spewed. So there we have Bloom, the blood sugar having drained away, and his mood really plummeted. Let's move on to page 209 and see if Bloom's mood improves a little. Well, there's some optimism in the second paragraph, because the sun freed itself slowly and lit glints of light among the silverware in Walter Sexton's window, opposite by which John Howard Parnell passed, unseeing. Bloom thinks, oh, there he is. That's a coincidence. I was just thinking about his brother, his now dead brother for about 12 years, Charles Stuart Parnell. Well, this is John Howard Parnell. We learn through Bloom's interior monologue that he is the city marshal, that he didn't particularly want the job. He isn't a particularly political person, according to the little that Joyce writes about him. He'd rather keep his own counsel at the Dublin Bakery Company playing chess with himself. But he's got certain responsibilities, but there we are. And Bloom thinks that's a coincidence that I've just seen him. Going down to the bottom of page 209, we get another bit of dialogue, a very strange bit of dialogue. Of the two-headed octopus, one of whose heads is the head upon which the ends of the worlds have forgotten to come, while the other speaks with a Scotch accent, the tentacles, and then the conversation drifts away. Well, what on earth are we to make of that? We learn, as Bloom, from the next line, we realise that Bloom has heard this conversation being spoken by a man at a woman who's walking alongside him. It doesn't seem to be much of a conversation because she's just listening and he's talking, although perhaps that's just the snippet that Bloom gets. And Bloom recognises this man. He recognises him as George Russell, known by his pseudonym A.E., a man of quite considerable repute at the time, a man probably the leading proponent of theosophy in Dublin at the time. I've mentioned theosophy briefly before, we'll do again. Editor of a newspaper called the Irish Homestead, was one of the two editors that Stephen had in mind, in which to whom he could give Deasy's letter. He's given one of the copies to Miles Crawford. He will give his second copy to George Russell in the next chapter. But for now, George Russell is simply walking past pushing a bicycle, talking to a woman. Bloom thinks, well, now that really is a coincidence, because I was just thinking about him as well. You may recall from a few pages back. Oh, no, sorry, he wasn't, but he was just thinking of Lizzie Twigg. And now he wonders, is that woman walking with him Lizzie Twigg? Before we move on, it would be remiss of me not to conject about what this conversation might have been about. It's a bit tricky. Very strange words. Bloom seems to think, it must be something to do with the occult. And sure enough, as I've said, A.E. was in the Madame Blavatsky, Aleister Crowley sort of camp. So the Irish Homestead was an interesting periodical. It was sort of focused on agrarian matters, growing your own vegetables, land tenants' rights, quite nationalist in his outlook, but not sufficiently nationalist for some, as it turned out, and quite, a deep thinker, philosopher, and really quite into a bit of mysticism. These words that have been put in his mouth are interesting. I can't really get past the fact that this octopus at that time was quite an anti-Semitic sort of symbol. This great animal with its sea creature with its tentacles around the world, and particularly a two-headed octopus. The two heads were the Jews and the Freemasons, and that's really confirmed or given credence to when he says that the other speaks with a Scotch accent, and many of the Freemasons in Ireland at the time were of Scottish descent. Many of the Protestants were of Scottish ancestry. King of England, Prince of Wales, tended to be the leader of the Freemasons movement. And yet, George Russell, I don't think, was anti-Semitic. He's not portrayed in this book anywhere as being anti-Semitic, and I wonder if Joyce is being a little mischievous. He's having a bit of a dig at Russell, and he has more digs, even though Russell helped Joyce, actually published, I think I'm right in saying it was the first publication of The Sisters and An Encounter that appeared anywhere, the first two Dublin stories, although once Russell digested them, he didn't want to publish any more. But he gave Joyce a start, and Bloom pays him back with his treatment in this book, and I wonder if that is part of the mistreatment, possibly, all conjecture on my part. What I find more interesting than octopi, quite honestly, no matter how many heads they've got, is the consideration of vegetarianism that comes next. So this would have been something that George Russell would have been into. There may be an implication that the fact that Bloom thinks about it now, I think he assumes that George Russell has had his lunch at a vegetarian restaurant. I think there was one in sort of College Street where they've come from, and as we'll know, George Russell was heading towards the National Library, which is where Bloom will head to after his lunch. And it's quite amusing in thinking about wedgie bubbles and fruit, and don't eat a beefsteak. If you do, the eyes of that cow will pursue you through all eternity. Nutarians, fruitarians. Clearly, Bloom, meat lover. The first thing we find out about Bloom is how much he likes meat, and particularly offal. But he's interested in vegetarians, and he's given it a go by all accounts, even though it didn't particularly agree with him. Further down page 210, we get the business about if that is Lizzie Twig. He's already decided it is. And look, her stockings are loose over her ankles. I detest that. So tasteless. These literary ethereal people, that's all there. But, you know, this food maybe makes them poetical. And he rather amusingly thinks, we'll take those policemen that have their lunch of Irish stew, sweating Irish stew into their shirts. Couldn't squeeze a line of poetry out of him. Doesn't know what poetry is even. And yeah, just thinking back to the loose stockings, I'm reminded again what Bloom likes. He likes a tight stocking over a sturdy thigh. Okay, let's move on. All this mood swinging, and some of it linked to sun going behind clouds and whatnot. Over on page 211, Bloom sort of takes control, because he creates his own little mini eclipse of the sun by completely obscuring it with his little finger. I do hope he was closing his other eye, because otherwise, with the effect of parallax, he would still see. He doesn't want to stare at the sun with an open eye, because that won't do him any good at all. But, you know, I get an impression he creates an eclipse. He takes control of his destiny, potentially. You know, this is a day of destiny for Bloom. You know, we will learn about, you know, their marriage has not been good for many years, for all sorts of reasons, but generally centered back on the death of Rudy. And for you know, is this the day that Bloom will take some sort of control back again? Well, grabbing hold of the sun, commanding the sun with your little finger isn't a bad start. I'm going to move on. 212. His mood falls again. Is this because he's obliterated the sun? I doubt it, but anyway. after he's contemplated thinking about going into the Dunsink Observatory and asking what parallax means, his mood falls again. He thinks, what is the point? It's not only tiny things like us, like human beings, that are pointless. Even look at the massive planets. Well, it's just a matter of time before they come from dust and reduce again to dust, and from there into nothing. So, and whilst he's in a down mood and thinking about planets and then the moon, he thinks about that fateful night only 2 weeks ago, the last full moon, as he was walking down by the River Tolka after a concert, and it seems as though Blazes Boylan was with them. Boylan, who has inveigled himself into the family, really, so much so that Millie, in her letter to Dearest Papley, mentions Boylan and says, "Oh, give him my best wishes." And Bloom thinks about, were they giving each other secret signals a couple of weeks ago as their hands touched each other surreptitiously? And then he grabs hold of himself. Well, stop. If it was, it was. Must. Yeah. Okay, and he sees Bob Doran, a character, this is where I'll conclude, a character we might remember from a boarding house, one of the Dublin stories, in which he was sort of forced into marriage after a one-night stand, and here he is some 20-odd years later, a depressed man in a loveless marriage, we might conject, but one day a year gets absolutely blind drunk, and this would appear to be the day. He thinks back as he sees Bob Doran wander into the Empire. He thinks, that was where Pat Kinsella had his Heart Theatre before Whitbread ran the Queen's. And I mention that not only to give a little plug to my pal, Brian Kinsella. I don't know if this is a relative of his mentioned there. But also, as Bloom thinks, when it used to be that theatre, he then thinks back to happier times with Molly, when earlier in their marriage, Rudy hadn't been born yet, hadn't been thought about yet. I was happy then, or was I, or am I now I? Quite a complicated philosophical thought. Which is the real Bloom, he's thinking? As I was then? Am I as I am now? Which is the real me? Stephen touched on similar sorts of thoughts in Stephen's own way, as only Stephen can, in chapter 3, and he will think on it again in chapter 9. But could never... I was 28, she 23 when we left Lombard Street West. Something changed. Could never like it again after Rudy, assuming that's sex. Can't bring back time like holding water in your hand. He then thinks of Martha Clifford's correspondence. Are you not happy in your home, you poor little naughty boy? And then, in this down mood again, he thinks, right, yes, I must answer her letter. I'll do it in the library. And so I'm afraid I'll stop there with Bloom in a bit fairly pessimistic, but you never know. He might regain his equilibrium. What he really needs to do is eat, and he will eat shortly, which we'll deal with in another video. So I hope that was useful to you. I didn't cover anywhere near everything in the chapter, but by using these mood fluctuations, I hope that was a useful sort of skeleton on which to hang some flesh. So thanks very much. See you next time. Bye-bye.